So first, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the second in our two-part Civic Engagement to Advance Food Systems Change series that we are collaborating with two of our fellow PSO partners. So in February, we heard from Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, otherwise known as PACE. And we also heard from two of our food system funder peers about some of the basics of how they ground themselves in this work. Today, as the title implies, we're going to dive a bit deeper into some additional examples of what this work can look like. We're going to hear about that from our fellow PSO Funders Committee for Civic Participation. Lots of tongue twisters, lots of long names. We are no better. Lots of acronyms, as well as hear from two other funders about how they apply a civic engagement lens to their work. And before we get started, I wanted to just share a little bit about SAFSF, which for those of you who may be newer, stands for Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders. Like I said, another mouthful. So as it says here, we are the leading PSO, or philanthropic serving organization, if you're not familiar with that acronym, that is supporting funders seeking to drive change in support of just and sustainable food and agriculture systems. We are a small nonprofit with a staff of 11 that's spread across 8 states. And currently we have more than 100 members who are made up of grant makers as well as investors across the country. And our mission is to amplify the impact of philanthropic and investment communities in support of just and sustainable food and agriculture systems. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And as I've said many times, our work is on sustainable food and agriculture systems, but we really recognize the importance of connecting all funders to this work of civic engagement. We understand that civic engagement connects to essentially any topical area that you're working on. So for example, funding this work allows us to support power building and getting those elected who support our recommended policy changes. And ultimately, civic engagement helps those on the ground who are most affected by those policies have a voice and have the ability to make the change that they want to see. So with all of that being said, I'm very excited to turn it over to Paul Ryan, who is the Deputy Executive Director of FCCP, who's going to give some remarks and then invite our funder peers to hear more. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much for having me today. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Paul Seamus Ryan, Deputy Executive Director of both the Funders Committee for Civic Participation and also our sister C4, the Funders Committee Action Fund. Today, I'll be talking mostly about C3 stuff, but I do wear both hats professionally and have for a couple decades with a variety of different organizations. And that will be relevant to some of my remarks today when I touch on some legal requirements and restrictions for civic engagement work. I spent more than 20 years as an election law practitioner and election law and policy practitioner. And about a year ago, I moved on to the philanthropy side of the democracy movement. I didn't grow up in a politically engaged family, but as a young adult, I came to understand the power and the importance of civic participation generally. Back in the 90s, I was a volunteer on a bunch of different candidate and ballot measure campaigns. And then I decided to go to law school specifically to study election law and political law. Over the past 20 plus years, I've worked at 3 different practitioner organizations. Most recently, prior to joining the Funders Committee, I was the Vice President for Policy and Litigation in the National Office of Common Cause. Prior to that, spent 12 years as Deputy Executive Director of the Campaign Legal Center, and I started my career more than 20 years ago at a small nonprofit in Los Angeles called the Center for Governmental Studies. All of these nonpartisan nonprofit organizations really focused on democracy and civic participation. Almost a year ago, I stepped onto the philanthropy side of the movement, both to learn about philanthropic practice and also to inform philanthropic practice from my own lived professional experiences as an election law and policy practitioner. The Funders Committee for Civic Participation is a philanthropy serving organization. or as my boss, LaShonda Jackson, likes to say, a philanthropy transforming organization. At least we aspire to that. We are made up of more than 100 members who are among the most active and generous funders of civic participation work in the United States. My vocation is building a democracy that includes and works for everyone, a democracy rooted in racial justice and broader principles of equity and inclusion. Funders Committee is right now unveiling a new strategic plan, which is rooted precisely in these principles of racial justice and broader equity. The civic engagement work I'll be discussing today advances these principles, and I urge you to root your work in these principles. So, why does civic engagement matter to food systems change? As a general matter, I've come to believe that through civic engagement, though civic engagement itself won't be everyone's top tier issue or passion, it's very valuable to have it as an underlying priority, no matter what your primary interest is. I think civic engagement is really the motor that drives change, regardless of the policy area. And just about everyone here today has likely forgotten more about food systems change than I'll ever know. Here are the experts on that. Last month, in part one of this webinar, Kristen Campbell of PACE gave a great overview of civic participation. It's kind of a 30,000-foot view. And as was mentioned moments ago, I'm here to share some specific civic engagement tactics and strategies you should consider funding and using to drive food systems change. I want to give a brief note about tax law implications. Over the past 20 years or so, both due to professional and personal interest and by professional necessity, I've developed some expertise in federal tax law issues that intersect with civic engagement practices. I'm going to touch on some of these tax law implications today. In particular, I'll focus today primarily on 501c3 permissible activities, noting where legal requirements and restrictions differ for private foundations and for public charity funders, such as community foundations. I realize we may have a mix of both with us today. I'll also touch on some distinctions between 501c3 and 501c4 civic engagement activities and how funders can support organizations operating in both of these tax statuses. I want to stress that I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. My commentary on tax and other laws today isn't legal advice, and I encourage you to consult your lawyer for guidance on the application of these laws to your specific activities and plans. I'm going to tell you about 3 different types of nonpartisan civic engagement work that are core to the Funders Committee's vision for building a real democracy and that present opportunities for all of you to engage. Funders Committee, again, is rolling out a new 10-year strategic plan. We're organizing our programmatic work around 3 focus areas in a Power to the People platform that are, I'm going to tell you about one type of civic engagement work in each of these Funders Committee priorities. So one of them is census and redistricting. That's a priority for the Funders Committee, and today I'm going to talk about census work specifically. The second priority area for the Funders Committee is expanding the electorate. I'm going to talk a little bit about voter registration as a somewhat light lift and simple way to get involved in nonpartisan election engagement or civic engagement. And then voting rights is our third priority area, and I'm going to tell you about a more sort of deeper dive into election protection work, another way to engage at a deeper level in nonpartisan electoral work. So starting with census, Funders Committee is an anchor partner in a broader collaborative effort known as the Funders Census Initiative. David Martinez, who will be joining me on the Zoom stage momentarily, is vice chair of the Funders Census Initiative. The census is a critically important government process. It impacts resource allocation in ways that touch all of our lives. Census data determines how more than $675 billion in federal, state, and state funds are distributed each year. It also impacts the distribution of political representation through 2 different related but distinct processes: apportionment and redistricting. Apportionment's the process of determining how many members of Congress a particular state gets. States gain and lose House members based on every census. Redistricting is the process of drawing the lines that determine municipal, county, state, and U.S. House legislative districts, the lines that determine who residents are represented by in these government legislative institutions. Undercounts of specific population groups feed and exacerbate inequities that have existed since the founding of this nation. Specifically, the census has historically undercounted communities of color. I should say many different communities of color. There are distinctions, of course, between them all. Immigrant communities, young children, and also low-income households generally. The Funders Committee and the Funder Census Initiative centers these historically undercounted communities in our census efforts. These concerns are what drive our engagement in the census work. As a general matter, we need an accurate count of all communities to build a democracy that includes and works for all communities. When David and Josh join me, they will share specific examples of how census work impacts communities they work with. I want to tell you about some specific ways funders can engage in census work in the coming years. As you know, the federal government, through the Census Bureau, which is housed within the Department of Commerce, conducts a census every 10 years. This decennial census is actually required by Article 1 of the Constitution. But in addition to this decennial census, which gets the most attention, throughout every decade, the Census Bureau conducts what's called the American Community Survey, again, year after year throughout the decade. Last year, as we wound down our 2020 census work, we turned our attention to the 2030 census. Historically, many funders stopped making grants for census work immediately after a decennial census is concluded. And this is really problematic for at least 3 reasons, probably more than 3, but keep it simple. The coalitional infrastructure that's built at great expense of both talent and treasure falls apart, and then it needs to be rebuilt later in the decade as the next census draws near. Second, the policies developed within the Department of Commerce and the Census Bureau, and to some extent Congress, that will govern the 2030 census are being developed right now and through the coming mid-decade years. And third, as I noted moments ago, the Census Bureau's American Community Survey is administered on an ongoing basis throughout the decade. So as a resource for funders, the Funder Census Initiative has produced a 10-year blueprint for philanthropic census engagement. I'm going to drop a link to this blueprint in the chat. So you can check it out. Ongoing engagement from philanthropy and support of census work is critical to ensure Census Bureau policies and operations center the insights and the lived experiences of historically undercounted communities. So some things funders can do and some work that funders can support in the coming mid-decade years include joining the Funder Census Initiative's listserv. I'm going to drop a link to that sign up in the chat as well. This is a great way for you, regardless of your area of policy or work interest, to stay informed about census work. So I invite you to sign up for that. You can also participate in census collaborative meetings. We meet 3 times a year. If you join the listserv, you will find out about these meetings in real time, and your participation will be welcome. It's a great way to stay on top of all the major developments in the field of census work. You can track foundation and grantee use of census data for planning, priority setting, advocacy, and evaluation to build awareness of how census data impacts and informs philanthropic and practitioner work. You can monitor and weigh in on census-related policy matters, including design and operational developments that are occurring in these mid-decade years that are right in front of us. For example, the Department of Commerce is presently welcoming public comment on possible changes to race and ethnicity standards to make them more inclusive of communities not effectively represented in the current racial and ethnic categories on the census. Though federal tax law imposes a prohibitive tax on private foundation expenditures on lobbying, census-related policy advocacy generally doesn't involve lobbying as it's defined by the IRS, because the IRS defines lobbying to mean communicating with legislators, and most census policy is developed within the executive branch Department of Commerce, which again doesn't fall within the IRS definition of lobbying. Another thing it's important for funders to know about and to do and to support among grantees is to maintain relationships throughout the decade between funders, PSOs, and practitioner organizations and coalitions. This takes some resources, not a ton of resources, but some. If a particular type of work isn't funded, it will understandably be deprioritized by budget-strapped practitioner orgs. So it does need some funding support in these mid-decade years. It's also important for funders to maintain relationships throughout the decade with Census Bureau staff, as well as state and local government officials who are critical to census activities, and to support their grantees in doing this as well. The Funder Census Initiative, we quite often circulate sign-on letters for philanthropy to share with government agencies when important policy issues arise that we want to weigh in on. So check out this blueprint document for more detail on these and other ways funders primarily interested in food systems change can, and I believe should, support and engage in census work. I'm going to turn to the second type of civic engagement I want to talk to you about today, which is voter registration. Nonpartisan voter registration is another simple, powerful type of civic engagement work funders interested in food systems change can and should support. This is one type of activity with different rules for private foundations and public charities. Private foundations may make grants earmarked for voter registration activities only if certain requirements are met, including, but not limited to, the grant recipient doing voter registration must be a 501c3 organization. The voter registration activities must be nonpartisan and conducted in 5 or more states, and they must occur over more than one election cycle. These are some rules the IRS has put into place to really safeguard and ensure that this type of nonpartisan voter registration work is truly nonpartisan and is not intended to influence a particular election in a particular state at a particular time. So again, if you're a private foundation, it's perfectly permissible to fund voter registration work, but speak with your attorney to make sure you're meeting all of the IRS requirements. For public charities and other 501c3 organizations, voter registration activities are perfectly permissible so long as they're done on a nonpartisan basis. It's illegal. It's a violation of tax status for 501c3 groups to intervene in candidate elections, but nonpartisan voter registration activities are not candidate election intervention, so long as, again, they're done on a nonpartisan basis. The voter registration drive must be designed solely to educate the public about the importance of voting. It must not show any bias for or against any candidate or party. And for any 501c4 organizations or funders that might be with us today, you have even a lot more latitude for voter registration activities. Federal tax law allows you to be partisan, so long as partisan election activity isn't your primary purpose. However, you should definitely be aware that partisan voter registration work can also have campaign finance legal implications. So another spot where if you're going in that direction, definitely consult your counsel to make sure you're aware of all the applicable legal rules and requirements and restrictions. Why should you support voter registration work? I think, first of all, the work is pretty simple. It's easy to incorporate voter registration forms and messaging into food systems work and work really on any policy issue. Voters elect public officials, and those public officials can change food systems policy. So you want to be electing, you want your people, your grassroots to be engaged in elections so that the public officials who are elected have values and policy priorities that align with yours. Public officials, and particularly legislators, they tend to listen more closely to their voting constituents. The polling of voters, often pulled from registered voter rolls, often drives candidate policy positions. So you can get ahead of where a future elected official will even land on a policy if you are on the voter rolls and you are being polled and the candidates in any particular race are following those voter preferences and sort of shaping their own policy preferences to align with those of the constituents whose votes they're trying to earn. Food systems practitioners and activists, your grantees, they know their communities and are among the most effective advocates for voter registration within their communities. Much easier to capitalize on existing trusted relationships than to have others who are focused solely on voter registration come into the community to try to do that work. So across all policy areas, we need to be capitalizing on sincere and healthy and vibrant relationships in communities to spur voter registration. So for all these reasons, funders primarily interested in food systems change should consider supporting nonpartisan voter registration efforts. And before turning to David and Josh, I'm going to finish up with a third type of civic engagement work. And this is an even deeper dive into nonpartisan election work. How many of you have heard of the election protection hotline 866 Our Vote? Anyone see thumbs up or logos? Sometimes you see them in shirts, bumper stickers, billboards. This is the hotline of the Election Protection Program. Election Protection is a national nonpartisan coalition that works year-round to ensure that all voters have an equal opportunity to vote and have that vote counted. The Election Protection Coalition is made up of more than 300 local, state, and national partners, which uses a wide range of tools and activities to protect and advance and defend the right to vote. I'm going to drop into the chat a link to the Election Protection Program website, so you could take a look, see what I'm talking about if you're not familiar with the program. One of the recent wonderful developments in the administration of elections across the US in recent years is the expansion of early voting opportunities through both in-person voting systems and vote by mail, both of which make our elections more accessible. Instead of confining elections to a single Tuesday when many people are working, many jurisdictions now provide several weeks or even longer for voters to cast their ballots through a variety of different safe and secure ways. But one impact of this very good development in elections is that the Election Protection Program now requires more resources than ever. So your funding support is needed now more than ever. The program has three major components that I'm going to touch on: phone hotlines, field program, and a digital program. I'll tell you a little bit about each. The phone hotlines, they're staffed in a variety of different languages: English, Spanish, Arabic, as well as several Asian languages, by different key partners in the effort, including the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, NALEO Educational Fund, Arab American Institute, APIA Vote, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. All of these key partners in making these phone hotline works. What are the phone lines for? Voters can find out all they need to know really about upcoming elections, questions about voter registration deadlines, requesting absentee or mail-in ballots, or how to vote in person during early voting or on election day. Staffing these hotlines require trained volunteers from all of our communities, which in turn requires resources. So it's a great opportunity to tap into organizations across policy areas with grassroots bases and to recruit volunteers and to resource these organizations on the ground for training and recruiting these volunteers. The second component is the field program. The field program itself has two major components: grassroots and legal. The grassroots field program is where nearly all of your grantees can meaningfully engage if provided with the resources to do so. As noted moments ago, as voting opportunities have expanded from a single election day to a multi-week or even multi-month elections periods, the resources needed for this field program have grown. The grassroots field program trains thousands of volunteer poll monitors to provide nonpartisan information, to troubleshoot problems, and to report bad practices at the polls to Election Protection headquarters. These volunteer poll monitors are stationed at polling places around the nation with a specific focus in communities with a history of voting problems, communities where hotly contested races exacerbate the chance of long lines or confusion or other complications, and states where there may be confusion about voter ID requirements or other laws that serve as obstacles to voting. Your grantees could do this important work in their communities, building relationships and helping ensure voters who care about food systems change can safely and securely cast their ballots. The legal field program is more specialized and may not be a great fit for your grantees. This is a smaller group of trained election lawyers who are on call to help address any problems that are reported from the poll monitors. This could be, for example, a polling place opening late on election day, and the election protection lawyers will start with trying to persuade elections officials to keep polling places open beyond their scheduled closing time, or if necessary, to go to court. So I wanted to let you know that that's part of this program, maybe not a great fit for most of your grantees or their grassroots. Finally, digital program. As we've migrated from phone use to internet-based communications technologies, the Election Protection Program has also migrated. It now maintains the website that I've already dropped into the chat a link to, with a bunch of resources for all aspects of voting. In addition to the phone hotline, there's now a text message option, and the Election Protection Program does social media monitoring, both for elections problems and also for disinformation. The elections problems and disinformation problems are crowdsourced, which requires advanced publicity and public education, as well as resources. Election-related disinformation happens throughout the entire election campaign season. So this is one area that would benefit greatly from resources and from volunteers across communities. More eyes looking out for disinfo, the better and the more effective this entire social media monitoring process is. A few final points about the election protection program. While the most visible aspects of the program are on the public's radar only right before elections, the work actually happens year-round and requires resources year-round every year. Election program data drives election policy reform work, advocacy to push back against voter suppression laws. These are laws that make it harder to vote, is required year-round every year. And the more people involved in these advocacy efforts, grassroots involvement, the more effective they are. So really benefit from food systems orgs and grassroots engaged in this work. Again, not as a top priority, but as a priority nonetheless to engage and support this work. Election protection work to make elections more accessible to incarcerated and previously incarcerated individuals is another form of this work that requires year-round support and a broad grassroots base. So there are many civic engagement opportunities for you and your grantees. I've spoken about census work, voter registration work, election protection work, and now I'm going to invite onto the Zoom stage with me, David Martinez and Josh Erwig, to expand our conversation about civic engagement before inviting all of you to join the discussion. David serves as Director of Capacity Building and Community Engagement at Vitalist Health Foundation. Josh is Director of the Rural Climate Partnership. David, let's get started with a question to you. Why is a health foundation involved in civic engagement work?
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you to both of the teams for having me today. And thank you all for taking some time to learn about the important intersection of civic engagement work and work that you all are leading in food systems. I'm David Martinez. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Vitalist Health Foundation, as Paul said, and I have the great opportunity of overseeing our capacity building and grants program here at Vitalist Health Foundation, and as well as our priority portfolio area around what we call civic health, which you can kind of use synonymously for civic engagement or civic participation or this broader concept of democracy. I'm joining you today from Phoenix, Arizona, the ancestral homelands of the O'odham and Accomal, 22 tribal nations who for thousands of years have come together to tackle their community's toughest challenges and work towards greater health outcomes. And in my role at Vitalist, I get to engage with Arizonans every day to learn about their passions, about their tremendous work in communities to improve the health of people and those communities, which is why I feel like I have the best job, which is really cool. And I get to intersect all of that great partnership opportunities, grant resources with our civic health portfolio. So what do we mean by civic health, and why is a health foundation, as Paul posed, involved in this effort? We see health as more than just health care. It's often referred to as the social determinants of health, or what we call the elements of a healthy community. So in itself, the concept of civic health or civic engagement, civic participation, all that encompasses this huge spectrum, especially as you learned from PACE if you joined the first webinar, is that those activities in itself are social determinants of health. There's a growing body of evidence that is showcasing that the concept of being in community with one another, with volunteering in your community, with giving to your favorite local charity, by community organizing, by voting, that improves health outcomes. So that's one reason why a health foundation is involved in the civic health work. The other reason why is the concept of civic health, or again, civic engagement, civic participation, that broad spectrum, is it's more of the means to the end. If we, as philanthropy, support civic health efforts, the means of the work, the outcomes can include things like healthy outcomes, health policy outcomes that are important to our mission. So civic health can be seen as both a means and an end. So the end being the social determinant of health, that is civic engagement, social cultural cohesion, voting, or it can be seen as the means, which is our work to support healthy policy outcomes, a more engaged citizenry, because we know when healthy people are involved in our democracy is healthier and it's stronger. So that's really why a Health Foundation is involved in the civic engagement work. And I'm really glad to be able to be in partnership with such diversity in the sector. So I'm going to invite Josh to kind of reflect on the question too. So like Josh, as a regenerative ag funder, how do you see changing the ag system to be linked with the civic engagement work?
Yeah, sure, David. Thank you for tossing it over. I'm very happy to be with you all today and quite passionate about this personally. I'm zooming in from very rural Utah. I live in a town of about 200 people, right on the edge of the Navajo Nation. So literally half a mile away is the Navajo Reservation. Almost every EMT or fire department call I go on is onto the reservation. And then the other side is Bears Ears National Monument, which is the first ever monument created at the behest of a coalition of tribes to protect their ancestral lands. Also happens to be that our county is kind of ground zero in the United States for racial gerrymandering to deprive Native Americans of a voice in their political system. So right where I live is very intertwined with civic engagement and democracy work. My background, I came out of a communications and political organizing background before I got into conservation and now climate. And so it's kind of my natural proclivity. The Rural Climate Partnership is housed at the Rural Democracy Initiative, which is a focused democratic democracy and civic engagement funder that has both a C3 and a C4 side. So it's a natural place for me to be thinking about how does regenerative agriculture intersect with civic engagement? And, you know, not having been in food systems reform my entire career, it's like the more I learn about our food system, the more I'm unfortunately not surprised that it's pretty messed up due to our political system. And like there are so many subsidies, there's so much politics that's interwoven with how our food system is broken, that there's just really not a path to fixing our food system that doesn't involve civic engagement, that doesn't involve, oh, God forbid, the L word, lobbying, that doesn't involve voter registration and all these things that we've been talking about today. Like, we're just not going to get there. We're not going to have like magically a transformation of our agricultural system without a lot of work on that side of things. And so I think as we look at how we fund in these spaces, of course, we're looking at organizing farmers to adopt regenerative agriculture practices. And it may not naturally be something you would think as being aligned with civic engagement. But I think I'm just going to give an example of something that we have a grantee working on right now, which is helping farmers land all this federal money that came down in the Inflation Reduction Act for regenerative agriculture practices, right? That in itself, getting those federal dollars, that's civic engagement work, right? But there's no reason you couldn't have a workshop explaining why and how to get that money, that you don't also have a table in the back of the room where you're doing some voter registration work, right? Making sure that folks get engaged in the political process. And I think the more intersectional we can be with this work, the more successful we're going to be long-term. I mean, I think right now, like, man, this last election, while a lot of rural people showed up and it really changed the results of the election writ large, we did have some negatives. And one of them is that from the Midwest, there is not a single Democratic House of Representative person that's on the committees that are going to write the next farm bill. Like, none of us in this food and ag space don't think the farm bill is important. But certainly, like, the game is changing if we do not get people to vote in our system and get involved with the farm bill and get involved with the people who are making decisions on the farm bill. So that's a long way of introducing myself, why I'm passionate about it, why I think other food system funders that are members of the food system funders group ought to be engaged. And I don't think it has to be like you have to like stop giving food grants, stop giving ag grants, and just like fund democracy and census work. Like that's not how it has to work. There's a lot of ways to get engaged. But I do think a common question that I'd love to, toss back to you, Paul, is, I think when people think of civic engagement and, this type of work, it's often perceived as being quite partisan. That like, if you're trying to get people to register to vote, you must be a Democrat. In fact, you must be a liberal Democrat, right? And if you're trying to get people to like show up in the census numbers, that's a highly partisan thing. So how do you see like making sure that this work is not only truly partisan by its nature, but perceived as nonpartisan? Like, how do we make sure that the work is perceived as nonpartisan?
It's a great question. And I have to admit that over the quarter century or so I've been doing this work, this partisan issue has become much trickier in the past 5 years than it had previously been. For most of my career, both major political parties were committed to the integrity of our elections. But in recent years, unfortunately, some politicians have become increasingly willing to put their party ahead of their country, to put their party ahead of democracy writ large. The January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol and the cover-up that followed is one of the most potent examples, I think, of this unfortunate reality. Nevertheless, I think the most important point here is the overwhelming majority of everyday Americans, this is within both major political parties, continue to believe that elections should be open and accessible and fair. I think in order to make clear that civic engagement work is really nonpartisan, we need to first and foremost center everyday Americans in all types of our civic engagement work. We need to make everyday Americans across the political spectrum and across communities the spokespersons for all of this stuff, for free and fair elections, for voter engagement, for the integrity of our elections. And when the opportunity presents itself, we need to lift up public officials who do put their country before their party in defense of democracy. And regardless of the party, we need to be cross-partisan in doing that work, showcasing or spotlighting folks who are public officials doing the right thing. I am right now coincidentally reading the book by former Officer Michael Fanone called Hold the Line. He was one of the officers who was present defending the U.S. Capitol on January 6th and was seriously injured and became somewhat of a celebrity in the process. It's a great read. If you haven't read it, if you haven't heard of it, check it out, because he was a lifelong Republican. He voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and his eyes were opened. He was astonished and really disturbed by our nation's reaction, but more specifically, the reactions of some members of Congress on Capitol Hill, their unwillingness to recognize or acknowledge what happened on January 6th here in DC. And I think he's a good model to emulate of someone who, he knows what's going on. He's more of an everyday American, and he's outraged at the political response. And he gives us a path to follow and ways to communicate with folks who might be very different from us in most of their lives, most of their interests, most of their backgrounds, but nevertheless share this widespread appreciation for the democracy we have. That's, I think, one of the keys to doing this work successfully and having it be perceived, not only be legally nonpartisan, but be perceived as such. But David, same question to you. How are you doing your civic engagement work in a way so that it is not seen as partisan?
Yeah, this is a really tough issue because oftentimes the resistance for funders engaging in this effort is by leadership and boards who don't want to be seen as partisan or getting involved in politics. One, we can't, right? We can certainly engage in advocacy and lobbying, but we have to remain a nonpartisan nature working in the C3 space. There's a C4 space that Paul referred to, and that's kind of a whole different animal, but just in the C3 space, the nonpartisanship is really important. We see that firsthand here at Vitalis because we often are turned to as a new neutral convener on topics. Right now in the state, we have a divided government. So we have a Democratic governor, but a Republican controlled legislature. But we're still trying to advance policies that are improving the health of people and communities throughout the state. And we need to bring people together. And as I mentioned in the intro, in my role, I get to talk with all sorts of people throughout the state, urban, rural, all sides of the political spectrum, working on a wide variety of issues. And when you're just trying to do your best in your community, you really don't see red or blue or purple. You are just trying to get the work done. And that, I think, is what inspires me in my role about connecting with Arizonans who are just coming together regardless of political backgrounds and just trying to do good for their communities and work on issues like addressing the hunger and food insecurity issues, improve the food systems, ensuring that more Arizonans are supporting their local farmers and local farmers markets. So like the overall work is nonpartisan. People are coming together every day. That is very kind of rose tinted glass Pollyannish, if you will, because obviously there is still a kind of partisan tilt, unfortunately, even today on some of these issues. But in Vitalist kind of role, we try to focus on kind of an upstream approach in civic engagement, the rules of the road that are established, as Paul mentioned, with FCCP's work in the census and redistricting and elections protection and elections reform. These are kind of systemic issues, areas that set the rules of the road to, as Paul mentioned, are determining the data that a lot of philanthropy uses to guide their issue areas. That data comes from the census, comes from the Arizona Community Survey. That's nonpartisan. We need quality data to ensure that we're making solid decision making. The efforts of the census also ensure that those hard to count communities are indeed counted. And this is where we hold a nonpartisan lens as well. We hold an equity lens in our work at Vitalist. So we want to ensure that those communities and populations that face the greatest disparities in health outcomes are the ones that we're really focused on. So in our work with the census, we identify those hard to count communities and work with trusted community partners to ensure that those communities are counted in the census. That is so important because, as Paul mentioned, the census determines the amount of dollars that are coming down to each of our states and our districts. And they are determining the districts, right? The redistricting process and how those communities' voices are heard in our elections systems and our election processes, which is why also we are engaging now in ensuring that the rules that are being determined that guide our elections are fair and inclusive, so that those voices, especially with an equity lens, are at the table and heard in a fair and inclusive way. That it unfortunately has become partisan in a lot of senses, but we just kind of keep it to the data and hold that equity lens, and that's kind of how we've stayed out of the nonpartisan arena. And our board has generally kind of seen that efforts, especially because they are so committed to us holding an equity lens. But you know, this is a tough arena, and you have to have really frank and honest conversations, especially because Josh, tagging you in on this, I think when people hear the word civic engagement, they see it as like a code word for turning out progressive voters, as you kind of alluded to, especially, you know, in rural communities where you're at. We're kind of neighbors, actually. I'm based in Phoenix, but we partner across the state of Arizona. I'm from rural southern Arizona, so I have a special place in my heart for rural partners. When especially rural partners see, you know, civic engagement, they may not see it as truly nonpartisan. But how are you seeing in your rural partnerships civic engagement as truly nonpartisan and supporting our democratic institutions?
Yeah, sure. You know, I think, you know, to be honest, there are two sides of this, right? And if you're thinking of it on a C4 side a little bit, which, you know, Rural Democracy Initiative has a C4, you know, people can think of it like, look, there are more progressive people in rural America than most folks think of. And generally they're pretty disaffected because they feel like they don't have a voice. but oftentimes big statewide races, like in Arizona or Pennsylvania, right, they can be turned by just making sure that like rural progressive people actually show up. And like you lose by a little bit less in a rural place and you win a statewide election, right? Like that's a legitimate strategy, particularly on a C4 if you're thinking about like turning out voters. But I think when you're thinking of as a more C3, like a truly nonpartisan lens, what I feel like, and this is based on my lived experience in rural America, what's most broken about our political system is that reasonable, moderate people don't engage in our democracy right now, right? It's really hyper polarized. And I don't care if you're like a moderate Democrat or an independent or a moderate Republican, like we need those people to be involved in our democracy. We need those normal everyday people to like vote and show up to city council meetings and protest against concentrated animal feeding operations that are polluting their water. Like we need those people to be engaged. And if we're not actively trying to find ways for them to feel like they have some sort of power in their community, some way to make a difference in their community, and they're sitting out the sidelines, what we're left with is just the people on the extremes. And you could call that the disaffected middle, you could say the tired majority, whatever term you want to say. But I think that's really where like you really do need a nonpartisan lens. Like we just want all of those people, those reasonable people to be engaged in our process. And that's what I think civic engagement is often about. And, I think of in regenerative agriculture in particular, like that's all about farmers, right? And I think farmers are super practical people. And in some ways, there are powers in our country that have like really got them to be anti-government, right? But if they see that government is working for them, helping them have more sustainable crops, to be able to survive floods, to get better prices for, better products, to have less like agrochemical inputs that are poisoning water, right? Like we want them to see government working for them and want them to have an engagement with that process. And I think that's, a lot of this federal funding that's coming down right now, like a great opportunity for us to do that. And if we do that with a civic engagement lens, like I don't care if you're a Democrat, or Republican, Independent, like we just want you to be engaged in the process. And I think that's really important in rural America, is getting those normal everyday people off of the sidelines. And honestly, that's hard in rural America. Like you do not want to be perceived as a Democrat in a lot of places, right? And just by like saying something reasonably moderate, you can sometimes be perceived as being a Democrat. So I understand how hard that is. And I think that's what our job is, to create a space for reasonable people to have their voices heard. And so, I think in that regard, Paul, I think you talked a lot, I really appreciate you talking about the census work and some of the election work, but, I think maybe closer to some of the food system funders' work is advocacy work, is policy work. So if you don't mind, maybe you could riff a little bit on the importance of that work as a tier of civic engagement work, and give some thoughts about how folks can engage there in a legal, strong way.
Yeah, I think the most important thing for funders to understand is that while tax law imposes restrictions on lobbying, the legal definition of lobbying covers only a fairly narrow subset of policy advocacy work. Under tax law, lobbying is defined as attempting to influence legislators' consideration of legislation and specific legislative policy proposals. So, for example, communicating with members of Congress and their staff about a specific bill, like the Farm Bill. That's lobbying under tax law requirements. There's a whole lot of important policy analysis and public education that can be supported by private foundations and done without limit by 501c3 organizations. And additionally, as I mentioned earlier, a whole lot of policy work is done within the executive branch, administrative agencies like the Department of Agriculture and corollary state agencies. So engaging with administrative agency staff on policy matters, that's not lobbying under the tax law definition. The example I gave earlier this afternoon regarding the Census Bureau, the Department of Commerce on census issues, but across your various policy issues, private foundations can fund C3 organizations to do unlimited amounts of engagement on important policy issues, including direct efforts to influence those policy issues when they're in the executive branch, as so many of them are. But finally, even though private foundations may not fund lobbying, private foundations can support organizations that engage in lobbying, both C3 and C4 organizations, using the IRS's expenditure responsibility rules. And these rules are designed to ensure that private foundation dollars don't pay for any of these lobbying activities. And to be certain, organizations that engage in lobbying typically welcome private foundation resources to support their non-lobbying work, because every private foundation dollar they receive, they can use to pay for non-lobbying overhead and programmatic expenses, frees up a dollar from another non-private foundation source that could be used to pay for lobbying. So C3 private foundation funding that is aligned with this type of advocacy work and supportive of it, though not directly financially contributing to it, is a really important type of funding for private foundations and other funders to consider. But so again, I think the big takeaways here is that, you know, the word lobbying itself is pretty narrowly defined in the law in terms of restrictions in the tax law. And even with respect to that small core of work that does constitute lobbying, there's ways for all types of funders to support it. David, what's an example of how you've tied civic engagement with food and agricultural issues?
Yeah, you know, Vitalist operates a little bit differently than most foundations. We have our kind of, you know, our grant making efforts like most foundations, but even those grants are more focused towards the policy and systems change. Again, we're trying to work in that upstream mentality. I used to work at a food bank here in Arizona. So as a food banker, I always refer to this example. Very rarely will you see Vitalist fund a food bank for their direct service work, just distributing food boxes. Really, really important work and an important aspect of our entire food system. But where you will see Vitalist invest in through our grant making is that upstream approach to tackle the policy, systems, or environmental changes needed to attack the root problem of, say, food insecurity or hunger, any breakages in the food system. And certainly during the pandemic, we saw just how fragile that food system is, right? When we were like struggling to find toilet paper and all of that. And of course, there are bigger supply chain issues happening throughout the world, but like we just see how fragile that system is. So as part of our grant making, we have an entire grants program focused on that systems change for collaboratives working towards systems change, multi-year funding to see it through, because, you know, systems change doesn't happen overnight. We need multi-year investments. It has to be geared toward a specific health outcome with the health equity lens as well. So that's really how we've framed our grant making. So in addition to a whole programmatic area around civic health, we specifically invest in policy and systems change efforts by collaboratives here in Arizona. And because we have identified food systems as a key priority of Vitalist, we have had tremendous success in supporting tremendous successes happening on the ground. So a couple of those that tie to the food and ag world are Double Up Food Bucks. So we have great partnerships with food advocates here in Arizona who have really championed this concept of allowing that concept with SNAP and the food stamps to get kind of double the impact of fresh produce. We know that there are limited supermarket access areas scattered throughout rural parts of Arizona, even in urban parts of Arizona. And even when you do have a supermarket access, you might not have fresh produce. And it's a part of the larger food system, right? As we know, the benefits to local farmers and the agriculture system and the agriculture industry here in Arizona with having access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So the Double Up Food Bucks is a program that was initiated here in Arizona with grant support from Vitalist to food and ag organizations here in town. So that was a great policy win, regulatory win, actually, here in the state of Arizona that we supported. Because we also support food systems, we have helped stand up different local food coalitions, food system coalitions throughout the state of Arizona. But we knew we wanted to scale that work outside of just little bubbles, individual food systems, local food systems. We know that it's a much more statewide and regional effort. So we affectionately support a coalition of coalitions, as we say, and there's an Arizona Food Systems Coalition that is helping scale the work of those smaller local food system coalitions. So again, these are people coming together to tackle their toughest challenges in the food system, how to support local foods, keep local food local, et cetera. And all of their work is engaged in some sort of policy or systems change. And then the last example I'll tie is something that was really inspired by the pandemic, though there were some demo projects that the USDA was initiating before them to ensure online purchases with SNAP EBT cards. Arizona wasn't one of those demo project states, but during the pandemic, obviously, the USDA relaxed some of their online food purchases from SNAP for SNAP purchases. It was a policy that should have been put into place anyway, right, besides the pandemic, but it was allowed under that emergency clause. And we wanted to ensure that it stayed in place once we got to the other side of the pandemic. So we've been working with a great organization and a collaborative here in Arizona called Activate Food Arizona that is not only continuing to push the policy change to increase access for online food purchases using your SNAP EBT card, but setting up the infrastructure that is seen as the systems change breakage to that access. A lot of it is e-commerce and online platforms and all that infrastructure that farmers markets, that farmers, produce houses don't have yet to be able to even get onto that online market and be able to compete with some of the big dogs like Amazon and Walmart. So this group is being supported with a systems change grant to help boost that effort and impact that policy to ensure that it's maintained not only here in Arizona, but across the state through USDA. So those are a couple of or a few policy and system change efforts that we've invested in that tie that civic engagement piece of it. The food, that's just one way that we have intersected. So like, Josh, can you talk a little bit about how the intersection works with in your world and maybe has some carry-on benefits that beyond food and ag issues?
Yeah, sure. One of the ways I think about this is, we're the Rural Climate Initiative, Rural Climate Partnership. So we're thinking about climate writ large. One thing is that polling shows that across the board, whether you're Republican, Independent, Democrat, if you're younger, you're more concerned about climate, right? And what do we know about civic engagement in young people? Like, we need to start the habit early. Like, voting is a gateway drug to other civic engagement and being involved in your community and making a difference in your world. So if we can get young people to turn out to vote, those people are going to be the ones that also show up at the city council meeting to, say, fight the expansion of the mega concentrated animal feeding operation. And then they're going to be, get that bug. Maybe they're going to run for a state house seat or something like that. And whether or not, whatever their party affiliation is, they have now been engaged in their community in a more rigorous way. And so, a couple of examples that I think of in the food and ag space that really lend themselves this way is the, organizing, very local organizing around concentrated animal feeding operations. And I think Minnesota is a really good example of this. And Land Stewardship Project up there does an incredible job of organizing local communities that are concerned about their water supply, about their air, their pollution around a very specific issue that's not a partisan issue. It's really about, the water and air. But then it turns into a way that people get engaged that have not been engaged in a really long time. Maybe they've never shown up to a city council or a town council meeting before, but now there's a zoning petition. Who shows up for zoning, right? But when it has to do with your air and your water, like, you show up, now you're engaged, you're much more likely to get involved. And in fact, right now there's a very interesting case going on where Land Stewardship Project is getting sued by a concentrated animal feeding operation just simply because they turned people out to vote in a city council decision about an animal operation. And now there are more people engaged in this county voting up and down the ballot than have been engaged previously for decades. And I think it's just an example of how a food system operation can have large carryover to many other operations. Another example I think we've seen in my home state of Nebraska, I'm originally from Nebraska, is how farmers engaged in fighting pipelines, are starting to see, hey, look, this big oil, they don't care about our farms. They don't care about our livelihoods and whether or not we can keep doing what we're doing. And they're getting engaged on the pipeline fights, but then being much more engaged on other things. And in my case, things like clean energy. Nebraska being the first red state in the country to have 100% renewable goal. So that's, something beyond agriculture that is benefiting from organizing around civic participation around farming. So I think there's a lot of benefits to seeing things as intersectional and getting out of our silos a bit, seeing how working on voter engagement or local policy can really feed up to a better system overall. And I think that's, one of the things that we're really focused on is how do we have these intersectional looks at building power that benefits local communities and local economics, and it makes our whole system a better system, regardless of what party you're from. So I don't know. I think we're now going to maybe engage some questions from the audience.
Yeah, specifically, does anyone have anything to share in terms of how civic engagement work has tied into their food and ag issue work? Thoughts or questions on the intersection there? Don't be shy. We do have a few other questions that were dropped into chat, one from Siri, one from Renee. We can either turn to those now, and why don't we do that? And then we have a few other, happy to continue kicking questions around, David, Josh, the two of you, and if time permits. But Siri, you put a question in the chat. Would you prefer I read it, or do you want to just summarize it or restate it for us?
Yeah, I can just summarize it. I've just been thinking about how I think within the economic realm, our media reporting has all these indicators that they're regularly reporting to help us figure out how is our economy doing and how is it impacting average everyday people. And I don't see really a similar kind of level of measurement and reporting on civic activities and civic health related things that everyday Americans are doing. I think a lot of our media reporting around democracy is around politics, the horse race, elections, etc., and not so much about like how many people are actually eligible to vote and how many of them are registered. Like, how are we tracking that? How are we talking about it? So maybe I'm just not aware of those kind of metrics, but I'd love somebody who knows more to speak to that.
I'll take an initial crack at it and then welcome David, Josh, anyone else to add to my response. So when it comes to election data, civic engagement in elections, so voter registration, voter turnout, that sort of data, the first complicating factor in the collection of that data and the processing of that data is that we talk about national elections in the United States, but we really run elections, 50 different systems for elections, more than that, because we also have territories, but so every state territory has its own electoral system. In many states, the processes for conducting elections, for maintaining voter registration rolls, for example, like that granular, they vary from county to county. So there is no single governmental body in existence that would or could collect and present that data to the public at a national scale. So instead, what we've ended up with by default is who has the incentive to spend the money to collect and analyze this data? Well, it's the parties and it's other entities that are closely aligned with parties. I'm going to drop one such entity into the chat. I should have characterized them as being as partisan as I just did, because I like them. I was actually, the organization is Catalyst. It is self-described, though, as a group that only offers its services to Democrats and other progressive organizations, so pretty partisan. Michael Frias is its founder and executive director, or his title might be president, I'm not sure which, but I was on the phone on a Zoom with him yesterday because he's a speaker at an event we're doing on our C4, through our C4 later this month. We did a prep call yesterday. Catalyst does amazing collection of data, but you need to pay for it typically. And yeah, so it's not quite what you're talking about, Siri. It's not quite the type of data that we do get on the economy, because we have a federal agency that is responsible for collecting and analyzing and presenting the public economic data. So complicating factors, the data's out there. I would love to see a way to disseminate that information in ways that are less partisan and that would also maybe grab the attention of reporters, because you mentioned that, what gets coverage, what doesn't get coverage. It's the partisans who are typically pitching the stories to journalists about the elections registration and related data. So I don't know, I've been rambling for a bit on this. I'll pause. David, Josh, any thoughts on anything to add to my response? And Sarah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about my response, like if I touched on the points you wanted more info on.
Yeah, great question, Siri. Gosh, data is king, and if only policymakers would just refer to the data in their decision making, how much better would the world be, right? And unfortunately, you get all this kind of partisan nature in politics and all of that jazz. But as part of our civic health work here at Vitalist, our kind of North Star are what we call civic health progress meters. And the two kind of areas that we're really tracking with data from the census, ACS, and a great national organization called the National Conference on Citizenship, or NCOC, that uses data from ACS, is around civic participation. So those kinds of factors that people normally think about when you hear the word civic participation, voting, and all that's engaged with there, but also just how you're leveraging your voice. So showing up to a town hall or maybe a zoning commission, as we're talking about, Josh, to let your voice be heard. Boycotting or boycotting, right? That whole concept of like, I'm going to intentionally buy something to show my support, kind of that, how people are participating in their community. So that's measured in a lot of different ways. And then the other civic health progress meter bucket that we track is connected communities. And I really like this one too, because when you start thinking about this big picture concept of civic engagement, or, like saving our democracy, which seems kind of crazy, but like the fact that we actually have to talk about it, and it seems so unattainable. So what can my little foundation here in Phoenix do, or what can like smaller family foundations or any other funders do to save democracy? One of the fascinating data points that is collected through this connected community civic health progress meter is just the fact that nobody knows their neighbor anymore. The data here in Arizona showed that just 12% of Arizonans knew who their neighbor was. 12%. So when we start talking about like the destruction of our democracy and the unweaving of the social fabric that is America, that's why we don't talk to each other anymore. I think we got that changed a little bit during the pandemic because we all were stuck at home, and remember, like people would clamor their pots to thank nurses, and we would have some sort of uniform activity. So people started to get their to know their neighbors and work together, deliver groceries for the senior that lived alone or whatever. So we saw a little bit of glimpse of that. We might be going back, unfortunately, to not knowing our neighbors anymore. But whenever somebody tells me like, what is one thing we can do or we should be doing to save our democracy, I'm like, get to know your neighbor and support efforts that encourage that more social and cultural cohesion. And I think that is a great role that food and ag funders can use, because food brings people together.
Anything to add, Josh?
I don't think I have anything brilliant on that data topic, so I'll let us go to another question.
We have one from Renee. Renee, do you want to just jump in and pose your question to David that you put in chat earlier?
Yeah, it's a just a short one. David, as you had been talking about, not funding direct food banking work, which I totally get. And then I was thinking back to an earlier part of the conversation when talking about how lots of food systems organizations are deeply embedded in the community. Just wondering if you've ever looked at, not funding necessarily the food distribution, but voter registration or engagement activities connected to or in the venues where people are doing food distribution.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Renee. We haven't really funded those kinds of efforts. We have, again, tried to stay kind of higher level with census redistricting and elections. So in elections work, we don't fund so much like get out the vote efforts or voter registration efforts. We fund more of the policy and systems change that is happening in the elections world. Arizona, Maricopa County, where I'm at now, is like ground zero for that, right? It was Arizona's electors who were objected to at the Electoral College vote, right? That then on January 6th. So, and then we're still dealing with that now, right? With our legislature in session. So there is a lot of systems change, policy and system change that we're focused on as part of our civic health work. But a great example of that just stresses this point of how any funder should be involved in civic health is in each sector, there are trusted community messengers, trusted community partners. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One, during the pandemic, right, you have all this federal resources coming down into like a lot of different places. And one fund supported here in Arizona, utility assistance. So folks who maybe lost their jobs couldn't afford the utilities. So funding went to utility companies to provide, to waive past due fees. There were restrictions placed on that through political, ness that just didn't allow the utility companies to just zero out any fund balances. They had to go to the client and get them to apply for the resource to have their utility payments past due waived. A lot of red tape that's a whole other animal. But the utility was going and knocking on these doors of the folks, and nobody was answering the door. And they're like, we can't figure out. We have literally money to give them to zero out their balance. And I'm like, well, if I had a payment due, I'm not going to answer the door of somebody from the utility company that I owe money to. Seeing their logo on a polo shirt, right, of that person, and they're like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. So what they did was the utility companies, through their corporate philanthropy, paid for a grassroots community-based organization that knew that neighborhood or the neighbors that they wanted to canvass and access the resources to canvass and knock on the doors. And they would answer the door because they saw them registering people to vote. They saw them getting out the vote. They saw them just out in community events. They look like the people that were answering the doors, right? So they were able to access the resources in a really big way. So that is where, again, the means. We have to support the infrastructure of civic health organizations for these health outcomes, or the more mission-oriented outcomes that each funder is involved in. So that's one example. The other example I'll give really quickly is during the pandemic, there was a lot to be said about trusted health messengers. But we know through the data that a person's doctor, pediatrician, your local clinic officials, those are trusted community messengers. And so when you go to your doctor, you obviously trust them to give you medical advice. So there's an organization that has the coolest name and branding called Vote ER. And they are tapping into this concept that health professionals are trusted community messengers. So they are providing them with resources to at their medical practice, inquire about people's voter registration. Are you registered to vote after, taking blood pressure and whatnot, and this kind of back and forth that you have with your medical provider, and registering people to vote. So there's great efforts here to boost that with community health workers, community health representatives, promotoras, in addition to like federally qualified health centers. So food and ag people, like your local food bank officials, maybe your grocery store clerk or your farmer's market folks. These are trusted people, and they can be leveraged to do something like you're saying, Renee, to encourage people to register to vote, and that makes you a civic health funder.
We got a question from Maria. I think, Maria, you had your hand up. Jump in.
Yes, thank you so much. Wonderful to meet you all, and I appreciate the chance to listen in. I have a question. I recently had a conversation with someone at 18 by Vote. They're working with youth engagement, civic engagement for registering folks to get to vote and to get involved. They especially work with minors, and it was the first time I heard of an organization working with folks who are not yet 18 to do voter work. And I am curious, you know, there might be restrictions around data you're able to collect about minors and about their civic engagement. But I got the sense from talking with them that if you can get folks at age 16 and 17 to be interested in voting, they're much more likely to vote and to continue voting from there on out. And so curious about if any of your work has touched with minors and getting and leveraging their interest and ability to get involved. Thank you.
I have some thoughts, but Josh or David, either of you want to go first? Any thoughts on civic engagement by young folks?
I mean, certainly in the climate space, like if you're not reaching people before they're 18, like, wow, I mean, it's a huge lost opportunity. And there's obviously lots of ways to be civically engaged that can be done without having to be a voter, you know, whether, you know, that's showing up at a school board meeting or a town council meeting, like we were talking about before. So, you know, there's a bunch of groups out there, especially organized on climate, that are engaging with you know, young people well before voting age, and getting them excited about turning voting age, you know, being that, you know, the first time they get to vote as well. So I think it's an important piece of the civic engagement puzzle is the youth vote, especially around the climate pieces. I'm not aware of a lot of data on that piece, you know, like, you know, how many young people pre-voting age are civically engaged. And that would be an interesting to learn more from folks that are, you know, do that all day, every day. Folks like Action for the Climate Emergency and other folks that we work with. Other thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't think our funding hasn't supported that specific kind of effort, Maria, for youth civic engagement, but our partners in the civic health space are engaging young people and organizing them, mobilizing them in our efforts to like get out hard to count communities in the census, ensure those voices are heard through our redistricting process, and now are engaged in all the rule setting that come with elections. So, I mean, grassroots organizing campaigns, I think, are run by young people, so they certainly engage them. It's really fascinating here too, because a lot of the grassroots community-based organizations that we work with have worked on immigration issues, especially engaging undocumented and mixed status families. And a lot of the students that are dreamers, the young people that are dreamers, don't themselves have the right to vote, but they can organize, and they have been organizing their communities. It's really, really been inspiring. The other effort that we're not, again, involved in too much, connected with our our elections policy efforts, though there are more laws being passed in this arena as an inclusive voting practice, is this organization, a national organization, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. They committed to this effort called the Commission for the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, and they held listening sessions throughout the country and compiled this commission to come up with this report of recommendations on what we as Americans need to do to recommit ourselves to democracy. And one of the recommendations is to enact more inclusive voting policies, like allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to register to vote and be part of our voting system. And now that report is called the Our Common Purpose Reports. Now the Academy and the Commission is going out across the state to encourage communities to adopt aspects or strategies, recommendations as part of that report and become our common purpose communities and work to enact those sort of those aspects of the reports, including more inclusive voting practices. I'm not quite sure specifically if the 16 and 17-year-old voting was part of their laws, but our neighbors in New Mexico just passed a really comprehensive, all-inclusive voting reform package that is meant to increase the fairness and inclusivity of their elections there in New Mexico. So definitely an interesting concept that I know a lot of folks are working on.
So on the data front, one of our board members at the Funders Committee for Civic Participation, Alejandra Ruiz, she's the executive director of the Youth Engagement Fund. They're focused quite a bit on engaging and mobilizing young folks in civic participation, both voting and otherwise. And then another organization that we work very closely with is the Alliance for Youth Action. The executive director, Dakota Hall, will be presenting some data on youth turnout. So not under 18, not minors, but young voters, nevertheless, how they engaged in the 2022 election. He'll be presenting that data at an event we're co-hosting at the end of the month with Committee on States and Democracy Alliance. So both of them, I believe, and Dakota more specifically, I think they are collecting data and analyzing data. They're doing some of this research on civic engagement for young voters. And on the policy front, there is some momentum behind lowering the voting age. It's just something David just referred to. There are a handful of jurisdictions in the state of Maryland that have reduced the voting age to 16 for certain elections. And there's a fair bit of research to back up that policy change, most of which is conducted overseas in other countries that allow people younger than 18 to actually vote. So I'm not super familiar with the data itself, but I know there is some out there. I would start with Alliance for Youth Action, Dakota Hall's organization, as one place to maybe get some of that data. Any other questions?
Yeah, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to jump in here and just quickly introduce myself. I'm Renee Katakalos. I'm the Vice President for Strategy and Impact at SAFSF. And I just really want to thank Paul for working with us to put together this program, and David and Josh for sharing your really, specific and specific examples of how these things intersect in ways that other funders can really learn from. We are going to be sharing the recording of this webinar, as well as the previous one that we did with PACE, to our full network next week, and encouraging people to go in and really spend some time hearing the great information that you guys shared, and we'll be sharing the links and different things like that were also shared here. So just thank you guys very much for helping us kind of open this new conversation at SAFSF about the way food and ag systems work can intersect with civic engagement. And I think as a final note, we will just tell everyone to stay tuned over the next couple of weeks. We are going to be opening registration for our SAFSF forum that will be June 12th to 14th in Washington, D.C. this year. That registration is going to open on April 3rd. So you'll be hearing more about that very, very soon. And also, when we follow up with the recordings of this, we're going to be trying to take a poll of folks around what next steps they feel like SAFSF could bring to helping them move more into doing some civic engagement work, or to better support the work that they are already doing. So we fully expect to continue this conversation and have other activities and resources that we'll be bringing to our members as a result of these conversations. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you on another Zoom stage soon.